He stepped out of the crowd just to save the woman sentenced to hang. In Dry Willow Gulch, where justice sometimes looked like a noose, a poor widow stood on the gallows for stealing a loaf of bread to feed her 5 starving children. While the town watched in quiet judgment, a man long seen as broken stepped forward. No speech, no plea, just one simple act that changed everything. And so began a Wild West story no one believed could ever happen in a place like this. The sky above Dry Willow Gulch was the color of bone, stretched thin over the noon sun like old parchment pulled too tight. Dust scuttled along the boardwalks, rattling windows and biting at boots. A noose swung from the gallows in the square, creaking with every breath of wind, like it already knew the shape of the neck it was about to remember. Sadie Whitlow stood beneath it. Her dress was torn at the hem, speckled with flour and dried milk. Her hands, tied behind her back with rawhide, were blistered and cracked. Her face, freckled, hollow, unyielding, didn't flinch when a stone clipped her shoulder. It fell to the dirt with a small thud. The children watched from the edge of the crowd, 5 pairs of eyes, wide, sunken, and still, each one too skinny, too quiet. The youngest, Daisy, had her fingers shoved in her mouth, like they could keep the hunger from crawling out. Sadie's crime was a loaf of bread, one loaf, taken from Goldie's goods, not stolen under darkness or deceit, but in plain sight. She'd laid 2 buttons and a hand-carved whistle on the counter. Goldie called her a beggar. The sheriff called her a thief. The judge, brought in from over at Chestnut Creek, called her guilty. And now the noose called her mother. The townsfolk of Dry Willow stood like fence posts, arms crossed, mouths pursed. No one stepped forward. No one looked at the children who trembled like weeds in wind. They just watched, as if watching could scrub them clean of what was about to be done. A man in a black duster stepped up to the platform, Marshall Roach. He cleared his throat, voice dry like gravel dragged across tin. "Sadie Whitlow, you've been found guilty of theft. Any last words before justice is carried out?" Sadie turned her head. Her eyes didn't plead, they burned. "My children were starving," she said, voice thin but steady. "That bread didn't belong to me. It belonged to Mercy and this town." Her voice cracked like a dry twig. "Has none." There was no sound, not from the crowd, not from the wind. Even the noose seemed to pause. Then a boot step echoed. 1, 2, slow, like it wasn't in a hurry to save anyone. A man stepped from the back of the crowd. Dust clung to his coat. He didn't speak, didn't tip his hat. He just walked, right up to the gallows. He wasn't tall, not broad, but the kind of quiet that made others move aside. Folks turned, murmured, parted like he'd been expected but never invited. He held out a paper, creased, stamped red with the seal of the county clerk. Marshall Roach squinted, read, then blinked hard. "This here says you married her." The man nodded once. "Name's Bo Remington, rancher up north, just got back from Powder Ridge." "You vouching for her?" "I'm not letting my wife hang for feeding her children," Bo said. Roach stared. So did the rest of the town. It was law. In Wyoming, if a man claimed his wife and swore to provide for her, the state couldn't override him, even if the town spat at her, even if the preacher refused to bless it. The rope went slack. Bo stepped up to Sadie, cut the bonds with his knife. Her hands dropped, red and raw. She didn't cry. He didn't touch her. But something passed between them, something not seen, not spoken. Behind them the crowd shifted, unsure whether they'd just seen a rescue or a bigger sentence. Bo didn't look back. He just said, "Come on." Sadie hesitated only a moment, then followed, and 5 children, silent as shadows, fell in behind her. The gallows stood empty, but the square would remember. Bo Remington didn't speak much on the ride home. The wagon creaked beneath their weight. 6 extra souls in a cart made for 2, and the mule snorted like it knew something had changed. Sadie sat on the edge of the bench, arms tight around Daisy, who hadn't made a sound since the gallows. The other children, Jeb, Luke, Eli, and Ruth, clung to one another in the back, eyes wide, lips cracked. Bo didn't glance back. He kept his eyes on the trail. Dry Willow Gulch faded behind them, swallowed by dust and silence. The only thing louder than the wind was the question that no one dared ask. Why? The sun dipped low by the time they reached his land. 30 acres of wind-bitten soil, fence posts leaning like old drunks, and a house that had forgotten the sound of laughter. The barn door hung half off its hinge. A stack of firewood sat untouched. The porch steps groaned under their boots. Bo swung down and unhitched the mule. "Y'all can sleep inside. Ain't much, but it's dry." Sadie looked at him like a woman used to being cursed for breathing. "You don't have to pretend you saved us for charity." Bo's jaw flexed, but he didn't answer. He walked up the steps and disappeared into the house. Inside, the air smelled of dust and coffee long gone cold. A single cot, a pot-belly stove, a table with one chair. On the wall hung a rifle, cleaned but never proud. Bo lit the lamp without a word. Its flicker caught on the faces of the children as they filed in like ghosts, unsure of their welcome. There weren't enough plates. He poured oats into a dented pot and stirred it with a fork. He didn't ask if they were hungry. He just cooked. That was the thing about Bo. He never said what he meant. He just did what needed doing and let the silence fill in the rest. Sadie stood with her back straight, arms crossed, eyes sweeping the room like she was memorizing a place she'd be asked to leave at dawn. She noticed the coat rack only had one peg. A pair of old women's boots sat by the hearth, small, untouched, coated in time. Bo noticed her noticing. He turned away. Later that night, while the children curled on a pallet of old quilts near the fire, Bo sat on the porch, sharpening his knife in the dark. The moon made his face look older, more tired, like it had been carved out of rock and forgotten there. Sadie stepped out, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You married me," she said softly. "You didn't have to. You don't even know me." Bo didn't look up. "Don't need to." She tilted her head. "Then why?" He paused. The whetstone slowed. "Town wanted someone to blame. Kids weren't the ones that stole. You were, and you were right to." Sadie stared, searching for the lie. "There's nothing left in that town but folks too scared to look hungry. I ain't one of 'em." He stood, walked past her, and went back inside. She stayed on the porch a long while after, not because it was peaceful, not because it was warm, but because for the first time in months, she didn't feel hunted. Behind her, Bo lay in the one bed in the house and didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and wondered if marrying a stranger to keep 5 children from hanging on to hunger made him foolish or just too damn tired of doing nothing. He remembered the preacher's words once, long ago, before the accident, before the doctors said, "You'll never have your own." Something about the Lord sending what you can handle. Bo hadn't handled much right in life. But he'd taken that noose out of the wind today. Maybe that was a start. The sun bled over the hills like a wound that wouldn't close. Morning came hard and dry. Wind scratched at the windows, dragging dust in lines across the floorboards. In town, the gallows still stood, empty but not forgotten. The noose hung like a question no one wanted to ask again. At Bo Remington's ranch, Sadie stirred the pot on the stove with a wooden spoon chipped from years of silence. The children huddled close around the fire, bones pressing through skin, too polite to ask when breakfast would be ready. Daisy still hadn't spoken. Jeb watched Bo's every move like a dog that didn't know if it would be fed or kicked. Bo, meanwhile, sat on the edge of the porch, fixing the broken buckle on one of his old saddlebags. His hands moved slow, methodical. His thoughts did not. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the mother's doubt, the children's fear, his own past circling like a hawk overhead. And he knew this peace wouldn't last. When the knock came, it was more like a strike of thunder against the door. 3 men stood outside. Sheriff Ernie Bragg, 2 deputies behind him like fence posts in bad hats. Bragg wore his badge like a coin he never spent, the kind of man who smiled without warmth. Bo didn't invite him in. "You got a minute?" the sheriff asked, though it wasn't a question. Bo stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. "Folks are stirred up," Bragg said. "Word got around you married Sadie Whitlow yesterday." Bo didn't blink. "That's right." Bragg pulled off his gloves slowly, like undressing truth. "She stole. The court signed the rope. And I tore it down. You can't just nullify a sentence by tossing a ring on a gal in the dirt." "Wyoming law says otherwise. She took my name. She's my wife. She's protected." Bragg looked past him at the window, where little Ruth peeked out. "That woman's got 5 mouths, Bo. You can't feed 'em. You ain't even got cattle in the barn." "I got land. I got hands. That's more than some men had when they started." Bragg leaned close. "Don't do this, son. Town's got its balance. She tips it. Folks already don't like how you keep to yourself, how you don't play along." Bo's voice stayed flat. "Ain't never been one for playin'." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Just remember, if any trouble comes off her, we don't hang her again. We come for you." Bo nodded once. "Fair enough?" Bragg gave a half smile, but it wasn't friendly. He turned and rode off with his men, boots kicking up the dust of what Bo had just invited onto his land. Inside, Sadie had heard it all. She didn't ask what was said. Instead, she placed a chipped mug in front of him, steam rising off weak coffee and stronger silence. "I don't expect you to carry all of this," she said, eyes low. "You didn't ask for us." Bo wrapped his hand around the cup. "I didn't ask to lose what I lost either. But here our Sadie held his gaze. "You don't owe us." Bo looked toward the window where Daisy sat with that tattered doll in her lap. Jeb beside her guarded like a wounded wolf. He swallowed. "Maybe not, but I ain't letting them fall just 'cause no one else will stand up." And that was the thing. No big speech, no savior's light. Just a man with scarred hands and an empty house, standing between a noose and 6 souls the world had already thrown away. Sometimes the last man to step forward is the only one who ever truly does. The dirt road to Bo Remington's ranch stretched out like a scar across the prairie. By midday, dust clung to the wagon wheels like it didn't want to let go. Sadie sat stiff on the bench beside Bo, hands gripping her skirt, the fabric worn thin. Behind them in the bed of the wagon, 5 children sat quiet, too quiet for their age. Bo didn't say much. He hadn't since sunrise. The wind was dry and sharp. It whistled through the dead brush, kicked sand against the horse's legs, rattled loose nails in the boards of the wagon like bones in a box. Everything about this stretch of land felt hollowed out. When they crested the last hill, Sadie saw it. The ranch, or what was left of it. A crooked fence leaned into the wind, patches of it missing like teeth knocked from a drunk's smile. The barn door hung half off its hinges, creaking like an old man with a bitter memory. The house, small, square, slumped into the dirt, wore its years openly. Paint peeled off like shedding skin. A chimney leaned left. One shutter flapped like a dying bird's wing. Sadie's chest sank, but she said nothing. Bo pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down. He didn't offer a hand. Sadie didn't wait for one. She helped Daisy down first, then the twins, then Jeb and Eli. Bo watched from a few steps back, eyes unreadable. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, dry timber, and something older, like time had settled into the walls. There was one long table, one pot hanging cold over the hearth, one bed stripped bare with a quilt folded at the foot that hadn't been touched in years. Dust lined the windowsills. A single chair stood near the fireplace, the legs uneven. Bo nodded toward a door at the back. "There's a room y'all can use, ain't big." Sadie peeked inside. One cot, one blanket, a floor that creaked in protest. Jeb leaned against the doorframe. "This your idea of better?" Bo didn't flinch. "Number just my idea of what's possible." Jeb looked ready to spit fire, but Sadie laid a hand on his shoulder. "It's more than we had." Daisy wandered to the hearth, clutching her cloth doll. Her small fingers brushed the soot-stained stones. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just stood there like she was listening to something only she could hear. Bo walked past her, grabbed a log from the pile, and tossed it into the cold fireplace. "I'll get a fire going. Soup's not much, but it'll fill your belly." That night, they ate sitting on the floor. Sadie, her 5 children, and the man who had bought them time with a name. No one spoke without doubt. The soup was thin, more water than anything else, but the heat felt real. The crackle of the fire made the silence seem less heavy. Jeb stared at Bo. Not with gratitude, not yet. Just caution. "Why'd you do it?" the boy finally asked, voice sharp. Bo looked over his tin cup. "Figured nobody else would." The boy shook his head. "Ain't a good reason." Bo didn't argue. Just sipped his soup. Slow and steady. Later, when the children had settled, all except Daisy, who curled up in a corner with her doll like it was her last friend, Sadie lingered near the doorway, watching Bo fix a broken hinge on the cabinet with a rusty nail. "You didn't have to bring us here," she said softly. "Nope." "Why did you?" Bo paused, hammer held midair. "'Cause folks only get tossed to wolves if no one's willing to stand between 'em. And that was it. No promises, no speeches, just quiet action in the face of a world that didn't care to remember. Sadie nodded, almost to herself, and turned back toward the small room where her children now slept. Behind her, Bo stayed up late, fixing what he could. Not the house, not yet. That would take more time. But little things. A cracked step, a busted shelf, and the door to that back room, he made sure it shut clean. No creak, no gap. Because even broken things deserved a little peace. The wind in Dry Willow Gulch never truly rested. It scraped across the land like a bone saw, moaning low through broken fences and rattling what was left of Bo Remington's windows. That first night under his roof, the house seemed to breathe with the unease of its new occupants. The children were scattered across old quilts Sadie had laid on the floor. Daisy slept closest to the fireplace, her little arms wrapped tight around that ragged doll with its missing button eye. The twins, Etta and Rue, curled into each other like puppies born into cold. Jeb slept on his side, facing the wall, knife tucked under his pillow. Eli lay wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling like it might collapse. Bo had gone out back, under a sky littered with stars too bright for comfort. He sat on the old bench beside the horse trough, a bottle of corn whiskey in his hand, untouched. He didn't drink, not anymore, not since Lena. Inside, a sound broke the brittle quiet. At first it was soft, barely a tremble, but then it rose. Sadie's voice, cracked, torn, came not as words but as a strangled cry pulled from somewhere deep. Bo didn't move, not right away. He'd heard that kind of sound before. From animals caught in snares, from men in the field hospital down in Laramie after the stampede. But it hit different now, because it wasn't war, it was a mother crying in her sleep. He finally stood, walked back in, his boots thudding slow on the floorboards. He paused by the doorway to that back room. The candle inside had burned down low. Sadie was tangled in her quilt, sweat at her brow. her mouth moving like she was drowning in words. Her hands clenched the fabric like it might tear. "No," she whispered. "No, please, not Jeb, not Daisy. Take me, just me." Bo didn't step in. He just watched. When she woke, gasping, she didn't scream. She sat up slow, wiped her eyes, and saw him there, just a shadow in the doorway lit from behind. She didn't ask why he was watching. She didn't apologize. He said nothing, just turned, walked over to a nearby cabinet, and pulled out a folded blanket, old, frayed, but thick with warmth. He stepped forward, set it gently near her feet, and turned to leave. But she caught sight of something stitched in its corner. Thread faded, but still legible. "Lena." Sadie blinked. "She yours?" Bo didn't look back. "Was." "Sorry," she said, voice a rasp. Bo paused, hand on the doorframe. "Don't be." He disappeared into the dark. That night Sadie wrapped herself in Lena's blanket, not because of the cold, because someone, somewhere, had loved enough to keep another warm. By morning the house smelled of oats and coffee. Bo had started the fire before the sun came up. There was silence, but it wasn't sharp like before. It had softened. Jeb still didn't speak to Bo. Daisy still didn't speak at all. But Etta said thank you before sipping her tin cup of milk. That was something. Sadie sat at the table, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were tired but dry. She looked at Bo, who stirred his coffee with the slow patience of someone who didn't expect gratitude. "Do the nights always howl like that here?" she asked. Bo met her eyes for a long moment. "Only when there's something worth hearing." She nodded, and that was the start of something, not trust, not yet, but a shared knowing. Like two people who had both been burned by the same fire and chose to sit beside it anyway. Outside, the wind kept moving, but for the first time it passed through a house that had begun to feel, barely, just barely, like it could hold something again. Bo Remington could ride a wild stallion bareback across a frozen creek, split a pine log in two with one swing, and stare down any man who dared test him. But he couldn't look a child in the eyes. Not for long. Not since the accident. Not since the doctor said words like rupture and irreversible. And Bo left the clinic in Cheyenne with silence heavier than the sling on his shoulder. He kept busy. He always had. The fence on the south side of the pasture needed mending. The root cellar's hinges were rusted clean through. One of the hens had gone broody and refused to leave the nest, and the barn roof leaked like a busted canteen. Sadie tried to help. She offered to gather kindling, clean out the stove, even patch the hole in the boy's boots. But every time Bo saw her coming with sleeves rolled and chin set firm, he felt a slow ache crawl into his ribs. Not pity, not guilt, something lonelier than both. The children kept their distance mostly. Jeb remained coiled tight, watching Bo like a wolf watches a trap. Eli followed his older brother's lead, which meant avoiding Bo's gaze like it burned. The twins giggled quietly when Sadie wasn't around, but hushed up quick whenever Bo entered the room. And Daisy, little Daisy, said nothing at all, not a word, not even a hum, until one morning just after first frost. Bo had gone to the shed to find nails for the chicken coop. When he turned back toward the house, he nearly tripped over her. Daisy. She stood right there in front of him, barefoot in that too-short dress with straw tangled in her hair and dirt smudged across her cheek. She held something in both hands, a ragged doll. He recognized it, same one she'd been clutching when Sadie nearly hung. But now it was different. It had a tiny patch sewn where the eye had once been. A crooked smile had been added with black thread. Its dress, no more than a torn strip of handkerchief, had a button carefully tied at the collar. She held it up, arms stretched toward Bo like an offering. Her eyes, wide and still, searched his face for something he didn't know how to give. Bo didn't take it. Not at first. He looked at her. really looked, and something behind his ribs gave a little. Not pity, not softness, but recognition. He reached down, calloused hands slow, and accepted the doll like it was breakable, which, in a way, it was. Daisy turned and walked away without a word. But that evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind turned sharp, Bo added something to the porch, a second chair, small, crude, but sanded smooth, sturdy. He didn't tell anyone why, didn't explain that he'd carved it from the same cedar plank he'd been saving for a new gun rack, didn't say how he'd stayed up half the night, running his fingers along the grain, wondering what the hell he was doing. But the next morning, Daisy sat in that chair like she was born for it. And Bo poured a second cup of coffee, set it on the rail beside her, didn't say a word, didn't have to, because in that quiet something shifted. A girl who never spoke had been heard, and a man who couldn't be a father had made room anyway, even if just for one cup, even if just for one morning. The first whisper didn't come from a saloon drunk or the dusty lips of a gossiping widow. It came from a child, barefoot and wide-eyed, who saw Bo Remington hand a little girl a raggedy doll and say nothing at all. By sundown, the whispers had turned to muttering. By the next week, muttering became talk. Did you hear? Bo Remington took her in, all 6 of 'em. They say he married her, at the gallows no less. Why would a man like Bo do something like that? You know why. In Dry Willow Gulch, rumors didn't walk, they galloped. They said Sadie Whitlow bewitched the man, a desperate woman, they called her, thieving Jezebel with a sharp hip and 5 mouths to feed. They said it wasn't bread she was after that night in Goldie's shop. It was sympathy, a spectacle. And Bo, poor fool, they whispered his name the same way you'd whisper over a grave. Some pitied him, others spat his name with scorn like he'd soiled the town with his weakness. When the bullet came, it didn't come with a warning. Bo found it buried in the wooden door of his barn, lodged deep, angled downward, a clean shot, a message. The kids didn't hear it, but Bo did. He didn't flinch. He just pulled the slug out with the tip of his knife and tossed it in the feed bucket like it were nothing more than a stone. Later that week, the town's preacher, Reverend Thatch, rode up to Bo's gate and asked if he could speak with Sadie. Bo met him halfway down the path. She's restin', Bo said, voice flat as windless prairie. And she don't need saving. Reverend Thatch nodded, pained. He wore guilt the way others wore their coats, heavy, familiar. They've asked me to step down, he confessed. The council said I shouldn't be consorting with lawbreakers. Bo looked up at the man. You ain't consorting. You're visiting a woman who ain't eaten proper in months. The preacher gave a dry chuckle. You know how this town is, Bo. They fear what they can't name. Bo looked past him, toward the chapel steeple in the distance. Then they best learn some new words. That Sunday, Bo went to church alone. Sadie stayed behind with the children. The pews were half empty. The whispers hung thicker than incense. Bo took his usual seat, 3rd row, left side, hat in hand, eyes forward. When the offering plate came round, he passed it on. When the hymns rose, he didn't sing. But when the sermon spoke of strength through mercy, Bo didn't bow his head. He lifted it, eyes open, staring straight into the heart of a town that had already judged him guilty of kindness. And he didn't blink, because men like Bo Remington didn't fight with words. They fought by staying, by showing up, by letting the whole damn town know they hadn't scared him off. Not yet, not ever. Outside, the bell tolled slow. Sadie was on the porch when he returned. She asked nothing, but when he passed her, the fresh loaf of bread from Goldie's, still warm through the cloth, her lips trembled. They'll keep talking, won't they? She asked, eyes on the horizon. Bo nodded. Let 'em. The first snow came early that year, quiet and uninvited. like regret slipping under a door. By the time the sun peeked over the ridge, the ground was already blanketed in white. Not soft storybook snow, but the kind that burned your breath and stuck like guilt. The kind that reminded everyone how far they were from spring. Bo woke first, as he always did. The kids were bundled together in one room now, like pups in a den. Sadie had patched the windows with old quilts, stuffing every crack she could find. Still the wind howled. He stepped outside, boots sinking a half-inch. The water trough had frozen over. The wind was cutting from the east, sharp and clean. It would only get worse. Bo spent the morning splitting wood till his hands bled through the gloves. He stacked the pieces high on the porch, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the house was holding steady, just warm enough to make it through. Sadie tried her hand at baking with what little they had. Cracked cornmeal, a tin of beans, some old bacon grease she'd saved in a jar. Somehow she turned it into biscuits. They didn't rise, but they filled bellies. Daisy laughed when she bit into hers, half toothless, full of crumbs, and Bo, watching from across the table, felt something shift. Not a smile, not yet, but a lessening of weight. Jeb, the oldest, had taken to doing chores without being asked. He chopped ice in the trough. He led the old mule to drink. He never looked Bo in the eye, but he stayed close. That night, the wind turned violent. The shutters rattled like bones. Sadie paced. Bo checked every latch twice. Then, in the blackest part of night, a branch snapped somewhere out back. Sadie jolted up, eyes wide, hand on her chest. Bo was already at the door, rifle in hand, breath fogging. "Just the wind," he said, but he stood guard till dawn. The snow didn't stop for 3 days. By the fourth morning, the firewood stack was half gone, and the chimney puffed like a dying animal. Bo built a sled from scrap wood and harnessed the mule. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, just nodded and left. He rode out alone across the drifted hills toward Larkspur Crossing, 12 miles through snow and silence. When he came back that evening, the kids ran to the gate. His coat was stiff with frost, his hands cracked, but the sled was full. Burlap sacks of flour, dried apples, a box of nails, 2 jars of coffee, and 4 thick wool blankets. Sadie watched him unload without a word. Then, shyly, she held out something wrapped in cloth, a small loaf of bread, from the cornmeal and grease. Her hands trembling. Bo took it, tore off a piece, and chewed slowly. "It's good," he said. She didn't answer, but her eyes watered. Later that night, Daisy climbed into Bo's lap. No warning, no invitation. Just a silent climb, like a kitten finding warmth. Bo froze. She tucked her face into his coat. The room held its breath. Then Bo, slow and unsure, placed a calloused hand on her back and let it rest there. Not firm, not soft, but enough. Outside, the wind still screamed. But inside, something had begun to settle. Not peace, not yet, but maybe a start. The first ones came at dusk, their horses casting long, broken shadows down the ridge behind the house. 6 riders, coats heavy with dust and guns that didn't stay quiet long. Their laughter was sharp, like the clinking of bottles before a barroom brawl. Sadie saw them first. She was folding laundry on the porch when her eyes caught the motion at the edge of the hills. Her fingers paused mid-fold. The sound of hooves, deliberate and slow, didn't carry panic, but something worse. Confidence. Bo stepped outside, rifle already in hand. "They're not from here," Sadie whispered. "No," Bo said, voice flat. "They're not." But he recognized them, at least the lead one. Virgil Pike, a name spoken only in low tones around campfires. A drifter turned outlaw, known for robbing stagecoaches and silencing witnesses, the kind of man who smiled while reloading. And once, 2 winters ago, Sadie had testified against him in a courthouse 50 miles east. Her voice had trembled, but she'd spoken. He got off, of course, Witnesses vanished, papers went missing, but he didn't forget her face. Now he was here. They didn't dismount, just circled slow like buzzards sizing up meat. "Well, I'll be damned," Virgil called out. "Ain't this a sweet little domestic scene? Sadie Whitlow playing house with the town's quiet mule." Bo didn't move. Neither did his trigger finger. "I reckon there's some justice left to serve," Virgil continued. "You remember that trap you laid for my boys last year? You remember what that cost us?" Sadie said nothing. "You led us into a canyon full of rifles. 4 of my men didn't walk out. That kind of betrayal's gotta be balanced." He smiled, wide and yellow. Bo stepped forward, calm as winter. "You ain't settling anything here," he said. "Ride out." Virgil chuckled. "You gonna stop me, Remington? Heard you ain't got it in you no more." Bo didn't answer, just looked him in the eye. "You brought kids here," Virgil said, feigning a look at the windows. "That's cold. They don't need to see what's coming." Sadie moved behind Bo, hand on his coat just for a second. Then she turned inside and began packing. Not clothes, not food, bullets. Bo built the first barricade that night, logs stacked along the front porch, oil lanterns hung low to cast shadow where a rifle might hide. He reinforced the windows with iron plowshares and moved the children to the root cellar. Jeb stood beside him as he hammered. "You scared?" the boy asked. Bo looked down at him. "Always," he said. That night, around the fire, Sadie leaned close. "If anything happens," she started. Bo cut her off. "If I don't come back, you take the kids south. Stay off the roads. Follow the creek bed." Her eyes welled. "Bo, you're not dying for this." He shook his head. "Not for this," he whispered. "For y'all." Outside, the wind shifted. Again, bringing the smell of blood and dust from the hollow. The riders would return. They always did. But this time there was something different in the air. Not just fear, but resolve. Because sometimes what's most fragile needs someone broken enough to guard it. The storm rolled in like a verdict, gray skies smothering the late afternoon sun, wind howling through broken fences and brittle trees. Hail began to fall before night fully settled, small at first, then heavy and sharp like gravel flung from the hand of God. Bo stood by the barn, slicker thrown over his shoulders, rifle barrel tapping against his thigh. The children were already in the cellar. Blankets, biscuits, a lantern burning low. Sadie had kissed each one on the head and told them not to cry. She didn't say goodbye. She knew better. Out by the ridge, a rifle cracked. Bo didn't flinch. He counted the seconds. 2 more shots answered, then silence. Sadie came up behind him, loaded Henry rifle in her hands. She looked like a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "They're testing range," Bo said, voice steady. "They don't think we'll shoot back. They think wrong." The wind picked up. Hail pelted the roof and hissed against the tin sides of the barn. The whole ranch groaned like it remembered war. Then they came. Not charging, not yelling, just moving. Shadows on horseback, slipping between trees and fence posts like ghosts. Virgil led them, black duster trailing behind him like a flag of doom. The first one breached the fence line and caught a bullet between the eyes. He fell backwards off his saddle without a sound. Bo ducked behind the water trough, levered his Winchester, fired again. Sadie took the porch, crouched low behind the firewood stack. She breathed slow, squeezed off shots like prayers. A lantern shattered. Another rider screamed and dropped. They kept coming. The storm didn't care. Hail lashed everything, stung skin raw, turned dirt to mud. The horses reared and bucked, confused and cold. Bo caught one in the shoulder, dropped to one knee. Blood soaked his sleeve, warm against the rain-chilled air. He grimaced but kept firing. Sadie screamed something from the porch. He couldn't hear what. Then Virgil appeared at the barn door, wet, furious, wild-eyed. "You think this is over?" he yelled. He raised his revolver 6 inches from Beau's chest, but Sadie was faster. She fired from the shadows of the porch, her shot splitting the roar of thunder. The bullet hit Virgil just under the collarbone, dropped him like an ox at slaughter. He hit the mud with a thud and didn't move. The rest scattered, not all dead, but all broken, like wolves who just realized the sheep bite back. Beau leaned against the barn, chest heaving, blood mixing with rain and grit. Sadie ran to him, slipped on the mud, caught herself on his uninjured arm. "You hit bad?" she asked. He looked down at his shirt. "Not. Are you dead?" "Good." Neither spoke for a long time. Rain pattered the ground like tired applause. When it was over, they didn't say, "We made it." They didn't smile. They didn't cry. They just walked back to the house, boots soaked, hearts thudding slow, lungs heavy with wet air and gun smoke. Inside, Sadie sat Beau down and cleaned the wound without a word. Jeb came up from the cellar and handed Beau a tin cup of water with both hands. Beau drank, nodded once, then leaned his head back. They weren't safe. Not yet. But something had shifted. And sometimes surviving one storm is enough to believe you might survive the next. The morning after the gunfire, the sky stretched wide and washed clean, blue like a second chance. The hail had melted into puddles, dirt tracks turned soft and sunlit. But Dry Willow Gulch wasn't quite ready to look Beau Remington or Sadie Whitlow in the eye. They rode into town slow, not in defiance, not in triumph, just because they had to. Beau's left arm was in a rough sling, shirt stained with a dark rust that hadn't yet faded. Sadie wore the same coat from the fight, sleeves torn at the cuff. Jeb sat in the back of the wagon, rifle across his lap. The younger kids stayed home with old Mrs. Keene, who showed up before sunup and told Sadie, "You've earned a moment to breathe, girl." At the general store, old Goldie came out with a brown paper package. "Bread," she said, eyes on the ground. "Fresh." She didn't add sorry. She didn't have to. The tremble in her hands said enough. Beau took the loaf without a word, nodded once. By the livery, young Walt leaned on the post, chewing straw, hat tipped low. As the wagon passed, he stepped forward and dropped a bundle of cut firewood in the bed, tight-grained pine, split clean. Then walked away. At the church, the bell rang, first time in weeks. The front doors stood open. Reverend Pike stood in full collar, Bible tucked under his arm, sweat lining his brow despite the cool breeze. He met Beau's gaze and gave a nod, not of greeting, but of recognition. A few folks watched from their porches, a few more peeked behind curtains. No one spat, no one whispered. For once, silence wasn't judgment, it was shame. The same townsfolk who had shouted for Sadie to hang now sent bolts of cloth, sacks of beans, jars of pickled beets up to the ranch. No names, just items left by the gate. And no one came to take Virgil's body. It lay buried under the old cottonwood beyond Dust Hollow, where Beau and Sadie dragged it with a broken sled. No headstone, no service, just dirt. That week, Beau hammered new boards onto the front fence. Jeb helped, learning the weight of the hammer, the way wood speaks when it splits. Daisy helped Sadie sort lentils into mason jars. The house grew warmer, not just from fire, but from noise, footsteps, the rhythm of 5 children daring to belong. And then came Sunday. The family rode in together, Sadie in her only good dress, Beau in his patched-up coat. The church pews were half full, half unsure. When Beau walked Sadie to her seat, the murmurs died. Reverend Pike cleared his throat. "This morning," he began, voice rough from disuse, "we are reminded that mercy sometimes walks in through the back gate, muddy boots and all." Nobody said amen, but some nodded. And after the service, Goldie handed Sadie a small cloth bundle, yeast, sugar, and cinnamon. "You bake," she muttered. "Real well, I hear." Sadie blinked, unsure if it was insult or invitation. But Bo smiled, a small one. That night, as the wind whistled through the hills and the stars blinked through clear air, Bo added a new beam to the porch. On it he carved no names, just lines. One for each child, one for each day they stayed. He never said why, but the next morning Jeb counted the notches, and Daisy traced them with a finger. The town hadn't spoken a word of apology, but sometimes silence is louder than noise, and sometimes it means the first brick in building something that lasts. It happened one evening when the fire was low, the bread was warm, and the house finally smelled like something other than worry. Bo had just come in from the barn, shirt dusted with hay, boots tracking bits of the world into the floorboard Sadie had swept twice that day. He didn't speak. He never did. Just nodded, set his gloves on the hook, and walked toward the hearth, where the children were huddled. Jeb reading aloud from an old Bible, Ruthie asleep against his shoulder, and Daisy curled near the heat like a kitten. Sadie was stitching by the window, candlelight dancing over her fingers. She looked up just long enough to catch the flicker in Bo's eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Daisy, the smallest, the quietest, the one who had barely spoken more than a few words since that first day. She rose, barefoot, dressed too big for her shoulders, and toddled over to him. No warning, no hesitation. She reached for his coat, tugged once, and said, "Pa?" It was soft, so soft he almost didn't hear it, but Bo froze like he'd been shot clean through. Sadie's needle paused midair. The room went still. Jeb looked up, brows drawn tight, unsure if he should be mad or glad. Bo turned away. He didn't say a thing, just stared into the fire a little longer than usual, then walked down the hallway to the back room, boots echoing, hard and steady. That night he didn't eat supper. He didn't speak to Sadie. But after the house fell into sleep and the wind began its low moan through the hills, Sadie heard quiet creaking on the floorboards. She rose, stepped out into the hallway. Bo was in front of the hearth, shirtless, shoulders hunched like a man carrying something too old to name. In his hands was a small wooden hook, freshly carved, smooth as river stone. He held it in place near the brick chimney, adjusted it once, then drove the nail in slow. Sadie didn't say a word. She just watched as he placed a tiny coat, Daisy's, on the new hook, right beside his own. Then he stood there for a long time, staring at the two shapes hanging side by side. She knew what it meant. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no. And in Bo Remington's world, silence was a language truer than any preacher's vow. The next morning, Daisy didn't call him anything, but she sat in his lap by the fire, and he didn't move her. He just let her be. That was enough. Sometimes love doesn't come with fireworks or promises. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in homespun silence, and sometimes a man who thought he'd never be called Pa again doesn't have to correct the child who calls him wrong. The frost held tighter now, painting the fence rails silver before dawn and icing the tops of the water buckets. The wind didn't howl anymore. It whispered like it respected what this land had endured, the kind of hush that settles in only after something fragile's been saved. Jeb had taken to riding Bo's old gelding, a sway-backed chestnut named Dunny. He didn't ask, just started showing up at the corral before sunup, trying his best to cinch the saddle tight and pull himself into the seat without looking clumsy. Bo watched from the porch, a tin mug in hand. He didn't offer to help, but every few mornings the cinch would be looser, the stirrups better adjusted, just enough that a boy might think he figured it out himself. Sadie had begun turning over a patch of land behind the house, with her bare hands and a rusted spade. Said she'd grow beans come spring, maybe squash, something that climbs and hangs on, no matter the dirt it's planted in. The kids built a scarecrow from Bo's old shirt, and a busted chair leg. Ruthie drew a face on it, and Bo didn't say a word when it looked like him. Daisy had taken to dragging a stick through the dust, tracing lines and circles all around the yard. One morning, Sadie leaned down to study what the child had drawn, and saw the shape of a house. Not this house, but the one Daisy must have held in her dreams. It had 4 windows and a crooked chimney. There were 6 tiny figures beside it. Each one had a name scratched under it. One of them read, Rem. Bo came back from town one afternoon with a cloth-wrapped bundle, said nothing, just walked to the back of the shed and pulled out an old pole, long since leaning into the wind. He straightened it, fixed the base, then climbed onto the roof with the sure footing of a man who'd never explained his reasons. When he was done, a small square of fabric fluttered from the top. It wasn't a flag, not the kind you salute. It was a piece of blue calico, frayed at the edges, just big enough to catch a bit of wind. Sadie stepped out and stared. She knew that fabric. It had belonged to Lena, Bo's first wife, the one they never spoke of. And now, without saying it, he had let go, not of the memory, but of the pain. The cloth didn't need to flap in the breeze. It just needed to be there, not waving, just hanging on. Like all of them, some flags don't need wind to fly. They rise because someone finally had the courage to raise them. The snow that came at the tail end of March didn't stay long. It melted by noon, leaving the yard soft and muddy, tracked with small boots and hoofprints. Spring had not yet arrived, but the land had begun to loosen its jaw. That morning Daisy handed Bo a wildflower with a bent stem. She didn't say a word, just held it up and waited. Bo took it with both hands, slow and gentle, like it was the only flower in the whole damn world, and tucked it into a crack in the porch post. Then he nodded. That was enough. Sadie still wore her old gray dress with the frayed collar, but her steps had weight now. She didn't flinch when the wind snapped the shutters or when a stranger rode by. The woman who once stood on a hangman's platform now stood straighter than most. At town, folks still stared. They whispered less, though. When Bo passed the saloon or the feed store, men tipped their hats. Not from respect, maybe, but something close to it. The preacher stopped by again on Sundays, sitting quiet on the porch after service while Sadie poured coffee into tin mugs. He didn't preach. He just listened. Nobody ever asked if Bo and Sadie were really married. Nobody dared. Truth was, they never kissed in front of anyone, never held hands, never called each other husband or wife. But every night, after the kids were down and the fire was low, Bo would hang his hat on the same hook, pour 2 mugs of tea, and sit beside her in the silence. Sometimes she would hum a hymn, soft and cracked with old sorrow. Sometimes he would whittle a bit of cedar, leaving curls of wood on the floor like petals. And when the roof groaned under wind or rain, or when Daisy cried out in her sleep, they'd both rise, together, every time. That was marriage in its truest shape. No vows, no preacher, no papers, just 2 people who didn't leave. The children were stronger now. Jeb helped Bo build a chicken coop. Ruthie stitched patches into old clothes. Even the baby, Eliza, who'd once been skin and bone, had cheeks like ripe peaches and laughed with her whole belly. And in the corner of the kitchen, beside the pot-bellied stove, stood a row of hooks, one for every coat, every scarf, and every soul that belonged in that house. Bo added a 7th hook, not for Lena, not for Sadie, just because one day they might not be 7 anymore, they might be more. Some folks come into your life like thunder. Others arrive like rain after a drought. But the rare ones, they're the ones who show up, stay through the storm, and say nothing while holding up the roof. That's what Bo Remington had done. And that's how Sadie Whitlow survived the rope that day. Because sometimes it takes the quietest man in the county to protect what no one else will. Not with bullets, but with presence and a promise never spoken out loud. There are loves never kissed in the daylight, yet they hold the power to keep a family alive through every kind of storm. If this story moved something in you, just drop a simple 1 in the comments, or even a 0 if you're still lost for words. That's all it takes to let us know you're out there. Listening, feeling, remembering.